All right, welcome to a brand new section, and in this section we'll be focusing on numbers and booleans. We've already had a bit of practice with numbers in the previous section, and we explored booleans briefly, but in this section we'll dive more in depth into both of these concepts, both of these data types. Now, the reason I want to dive more in depth into these things is because I want to give you a stronger foundation in Ruby the language as a whole. A lot of other courses will simply dive immediately into all the things you can do with programming, including Ruby. But then when it comes time to tie them all together, it's a lot harder because you don't have a strong foundation in just how Ruby works. You don't have a strong understanding of objects and methods and that kind of stuff. So I want to take things a little bit slower and kind of build one piece at a time incrementally to give you a better understanding of Ruby as a whole. And rest assured, all of the common programming ideas like loops and if statements and conditionals, we'll dive into that in great detail later. For now, I just kind of want to keep building upon everything that we've started learning so far. So let's begin with a quick review of numbers. There's two types of numbers in Ruby. There are integers and floating point numbers. So an integer is a whole number. So if I do something like 5 and 0 and 100 and let's say negative 837, these are all examples of integers. They are whole numbers. They have no fractional or decimal components. An integer is a whole number. We also have floating point numbers. A floating point number includes a decimal or a fractional component. So for example, 5.987 is an example, 2.71, negative 10.23. These are all just random examples of floating point numbers. It doesn't matter whether they're negative or positive. As long as they have a decimal component, they are a floating point number. Now, the key takeaway, the thing I always keep saying is that everything in Ruby is an object. Everything here is an object. The seven numbers, including the integers and the floating point numbers, are all objects. And an object is just a thing. It's a data structure within a programming language. Now, whenever we create an object, it's going to have functionalities, which are called methods. Those are messages that you can pass to the object. And the object type will determine what kind of messages you can send to that object. So for example, in the previous section, we explored the next method on an integer. So we can do something like next on these first two lines, and we can see that it's going to give us 6 and 1, which is 1 greater than whatever integer we're calling that next method on. The reason that functionality is possible is because these numbers or these objects come from a common blueprint. So even though the numbers themselves are different, in this case it's 5 and 0, they come from a common blueprint which allows it to have common functionality like the next method. It doesn't matter what integer you're working with, every integer will have a next method because that is part of the integer's design. So the word that we use in programming that describes the blueprint from which an object is made is called a class. And a class is just the template, if you will, for each object that's created from it. So if the house is the object, the blueprint that kind of specifies how the house will be built is what we call the class. So it's not the actual thing itself, it's more of a guideline or a template or a model for how something will be built. So we have a integer class. It's actually called a fixnum class in Ruby, and that's the blueprint from which every single integer in Ruby is created. It doesn't matter whether it's 5 or 0 or 100. Each one of them is created from that blueprint, and because it's the same blueprint, each of these integer objects are going to have a next method. And it's the exact same process with floating point numbers. Floating point numbers have a different functionality. They also have similar functionality to integers. And floating point numbers come from their own different class, their own different blueprint. Now, as I mentioned, objects of different types are going to have methods in common. One of the methods that every single object in Ruby shares, whether it's an integer or a floating point number or a string, is a class method. And that class method gives us the blueprint or the class that that object is created from. So for example, if I replace this next right here with .class, that's just a method just like next, which we explored, just like toS, which we explored. It's just another message that we can send to the object, except what this does is tells Ruby to give us what blueprint that was made of. We can see that the integers here are made from a class called fixnum. It doesn't matter what integer we call this class method on. If I do .class on my other two integers, you can see right here that they're all fixnum. They're all coming from the same common blueprint, which is what we call the class. And if I repeat the exact same thing on the floating point numbers below, if I do .class, we can see that all of these are coming from a common class or a common blueprint of float. So these are actually two different classes, the way that integers operate and the way that floating point numbers operate. They each come from their own separate blueprint. However, they also have things in common. We can see an example right here. Even though these are two different objects, they each have a class method which tells you what created that object. So even though they're different in design and how they operate, they also have features in common. Certain methods are exclusive, certain methods are shared. One last thing before we conclude this lesson. There is actually another type of class that allows us to create another type of numeric object, and that is the big num class in comparison to the fixed num class. And the big num class is used for really large numbers. Usually I don't find myself using this a lot, but it does exist. So if I take a really large number, let's do something like 9999999999999999999. That should be big enough. If I do dot class on this, we can see that it is a big num. Basically, that's a class that's made for really large numbers that kind of are much greater than what you find in the fixed num class. But that's just another one. We really won't be playing around with it a lot in the course. But again, you can see even if it's a big num object in this case, that object is also going to have a method called class, which is going to tell us what blueprint it came from or what class it came from, and that blueprint is called big num. So hopefully this is starting to give you a greater sense of how Ruby's objects work. They each come from a common creation point, which is the blueprint, and that's what allows them to have the common functionalities. Now, different blueprints, for example, the fixed num blueprint and the float blueprint, or the classes as we call them, may have unique methods. Then they may have shared methods. For example, class is a method that's available on all objects, while things like next is something that is only going to be available on an integer. I can show you this, in fact, by trying to call next on my first floating point, and we're going to get a big bright red error. We can see undefined method next for a float. It doesn't exist on a float, but it does exist on a fixed num object. So kind of understanding that sense of how things are structured, understanding that methods are available here but not there, understanding that the messages that an object can receive is dependent on what it's made from, what blueprint it's created from, will give you a much better understanding of Ruby as a language, and it will allow you to understand some of the more complex concepts that we dive into later with greater ease. So that's why I want to kind of give you a better understanding of numbers in this section, including some of the methods available to them before we dive into the more standard programming concepts. So I'll see you in the next lesson.